Welcome to the first episode of the Super Dynasty Bros podcast. My name is Ben McCowan. I'll be your host with Austin here to my right. So this is our inaugural episode, and we are looking forward to sharing with you guys some of the things that we are doing right now in trades, whether it be you are a contender or you are a rebuilder. A little bit of background behind myself. My name is Ben. I'm a physical therapist in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I've been playing fantasy for around 15 plus years, and I just got dabbled into Dynasty within the last couple of years, and it's been a really, really fun ride. So I'll leave it to Austin. Tell us a little bit about yourself, man.
Yeah, hey Ben, excited to be doing this. So my name's Austin. I've been doing Dynasty for about 5 years, but just like you, about since I was about 8 years old, I've been playing fantasy football. Way back before, I think first played on Fox Sports, who I don't even think has a fantasy. I don't, as far as I know, I don't think they do fantasy football anymore. But yeah, so I've been really interested in it for about 20 years, really. But yeah, Dynasty in the last 5 years, but I would say that going from focusing on just redraft, doing one or two redraft leagues a year, to now I'm in, 15 leagues, most of which are dynasty leagues, and kind of developing sort of a portfolio of players, treating a league as more than just that one league, sort of just having a wide variety of different players across leagues, and kind of trying to execute different strategies. And so that's kind of been my focus. Try to be a little bit player agnostic, but also give you some player takes,
Yeah,
but be more about the overall process of building a team and making trades that make sense, constantly making tweaks. And so I'm really excited to get talking about
yeah,
all of that.
definitely. And I think that's a conversation you and I've had previously of just process over players versus players over process and what that looks
Yeah.
like. So while we're kind of on the topic of talking trades and everything like that, while things are going right now, we have many leagues that have trade deadlines this week, and
Yeah.
you and I have some ideas as far as some trade ideas or targets to get for contenders and rebuilders. And I wanted
Yeah.
to start off the chat a little bit about contenders today. So Austin, I want you to lead things off. I saw you have some good contenders up there. Let's go ahead with your first guy.
Yeah, so my first guy is a guy I have in a couple leagues and really like him. And I think he goes under the radar a little bit every single year, and it's Mike Evans. And I think that right now, you look at a guy who's over 30 years old, and a lot of people are like, oh, he's dead for Dynasty. He just came off a hamstring injury. But I actually think there's a lot to like for this stretch run. I think when you look at the way the Bucks have performed the last few weeks, when Evans and Godwin have both been out, it has not been pretty. They had Jalen McMillan, Trey Palmer, Sterling Shepard have not really been able to fill any kind of gap there, and Baker has struggled and has had to really focusing on checking it down at the tight end. Kate Otten has 39 targets over the last 4 weeks. In the, that's almost 10 per game. In the 6 weeks prior, he had 31 targets, which is about 5 per game. So his targets have doubled over the last 3 games with both guys out. You've got to think a lot of that volume is going to shift to Mike Evans with him coming back, and all signs point to him coming back this week. I saw Jacob Gibbs on Twitter said he had a stat where it was if you took all of the times that Chris Godwin was off the field, basically you took in the last 3 years when Chris Godwin was not on the field, Mike Evans ranks second in the NFL in fantasy points per route run.
Yeah,
He's only behind Tyreek Hill, and he's ahead of Justin Jefferson, Nico Collins, AJ Brown, ahead of all of them. And I think that you're going to see unreal target volume here, assuming that he's fully healthy. And it seems like they waited longer than they needed to, kind of use the bye week to kind of get him an extra week of recovery, and it looks like he's going to be fine. I think it could be a buy low point. I don't think that people that aren't competing are like, I got to hang on to Mike Evans. So
yeah,
it could be a good spot. I will say this too. A lot has been talked about Mike Evans. For the first 10 years of his career, every year he's had 1,000 yards. This would be the 11th year if he can do it this year. In order to make that, he would need to average 95 yards per game the rest of the year. And I think that he's motivated to go for it. So it would not surprise me if he ended up getting there. And if he gets 95 yards a game the rest of the year, you're going to end up really happy you traded for him. One last point. He has been really good against the Carolina Panthers. His last 2 times playing Carolina at home in Tampa, Last year, he had 29.2 PPR fantasy points. And then 2 years ago, a lot of us remember this, in the championship game, week 17, he had 48.7 PPR fantasy points against the Panthers. And I ended up losing a league because of that. And so I remember it well. But who does he play in week 17 this year? The Carolina Panthers at Tampa. So I think it's a good buy. Keep Trade Cut right now has a fair trade for Mike Evans being a second and a fourth. I
Woo!
don't know if you necessarily can get that, but I would do that all day, every day. If I'm a contender, I might even be willing, and I'm confident I'm going to get a bye. I think that's key. Confident you're going to get a bye, so you'll be in the semifinals, probably in the finals. I would be willing to maybe trade a late first. I think that might be a little bit of an overpay, but if you can get a second and a small piece for Mike Evans, I think that's a good deal.
And here's the thing, man. When you're trying to win a championship, a 25 late first doesn't really mean anything. So you got to go for it. And Mike Evans is a great buy.
Yeah.
All right. So as far as my buy for right now for contenders, I love George Pickens, and I think a lot of people do. So I don't think that it's going to be a cheap buy, but at the same time, I think he is still at a place where you can buy him low, right? I think George Pickens still hasn't reached his ceiling, and as we're seeing with his relationship with Russ, he is getting the long balls. He is able to catch anything in his radius, and honestly, he is a much cheaper option at a wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 on your team. Definitely safer at a wide receiver 2 on a team for a contender. But to be able to trade maybe, in my mind, somebody like Cedric Tillman in a second for George Pickens, I feel pretty confident about, especially for a contender trying to make some noise in the playoffs. And I think as far as I'm concerned with his playoff schedule, he is playing against the Browns tomorrow. The Browns are ranked right now as the 16th ranked pass defense in the NFL. Following that, he actually has a pretty juicy matchup against the Bengals. Then back against the Steelers. Back against the Browns. And then he faces off against the Eagles. A little bit tougher, probably, since he'll have Quinyon Mitchell on him. But he plays the Ravens, Chiefs, and Bengals. He should be hitting up there at the end of the
Yeah.
season. So George Pickens right now, great buy for me. Like I said, to me, I don't think you're going to get him for probably just a 25 first. To me, probably giving somebody a down tier, somebody like Cedric Tillman in a second, to try and buy him, I would probably take that if I can get it. But I don't know how you feel about it, Austin. That's kind of where I'm at with George.
Yeah, I think the tricky thing with George Pickens is the age. Excuse me. I think you're going to have a hard. I love it. Like, I want to acquire him on contending teams, but I think rebuilding teams want to hang on to George Pickens. So you
Yeah,
may have to pay a high premium. Not saying it's not necessarily worth it, but I don't know if necessarily Tillman in a second would get it done. If you can do that, I would do that all day.
yeah,
But I think you're probably going to have to give up a first and maybe a small piece.
yeah.
But that might be worth it. Some fun facts about his age. So George Pickens is 3 months younger than Jaden Daniels. And he's also younger than Zay Flowers, Rashee Rice, Jaden Reed, and Garrett Wilson. I mean, these are all guys that people consider very young. Half those guys I just mentioned were drafted last year. So, I mean, he's still very young. He won't be 24 until March. So I think when we look at a guy like that, it seems to be ascending. And it seems like he's sort of gotten, kind of his irrational activity or whatever was going on last year kind of out of the way. He's happy with his target share. He seems to have a good rapport with Russell Wilson. This seems like a guy that we could be talking about as a top 10, dynasty receiver in the offseason if he continues at this pace. So yeah, I mean, I'm willing to try to buy him.
Yeah.
I just think that it's not going to be cheap is because of the age.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of target share, so right now he has the most targets on the team at 77 targets on the year, and he has a 62% catch rate. Obviously, part of that was Justin Fields. With Russell Wilson, you have a much better opportunity for him to be able to catch the ball. We have seen some crazy, insane catches from George Pickens. And for me, if I'm contending team and I have a late 25 first and potentially somebody as an add-on, I probably would take Pickens.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think you can't go wrong with that. So I'm going to move to another one here. This is interesting. So I think that when you kind of look back at teams, and this is more of a redraft stat, but this applies to Dynasty because you're trying to do the same thing when you're a contender as you are in a redraft league. You're trying to win this season. But when you look at charts of teams that win championships, teams that win the big weeks, they have an elite tight end. And it seems to always be the case. Travis Kelce was consistently one of the most owned players on championship teams over the last 5 years. Not so much last year, but the years before that. When you're talking about a guy that was far and away the lead tight end. And so if you can kind of find that guy and lock that down, I think you're, especially as an add-on to a team that's already a contender, could be huge. In 1.5 tight end premium scoring, George Kittle is averaging 20.3 fantasy points per game this year, which is first in fantasy points per game, even over Brock Bowers after his massive game last week. That is 5 points per game more than third, Trey McBride. So you're looking at basically Bowers is right there, but Bowers is going to cost you an arm and a leg. Bowers is a borderline first round startup pick in tight end premium leagues at this point. I mean, he is a bona fide stud. I think if you did some rookie redrafts, he might go as high as 2 or 3 overall. I think people are saying this is Travis Kelce that's 22, 23 years old. So the fact that you have a guy that's currently this season outscoring him, that's still consistently performing, and it doesn't seem like his career is coming to an end anytime soon. The 49ers obviously have a target vacuum with Brandon Ayuk out for the year. And George Kittle, a little banged up. Not anything to be too concerned about. They said all week they thought he was perfectly fine and was going to play. But they played it safe, and it seems like he's going to play this week. So to me, there may be a smallish buy window where you're just like, maybe somebody's like, that's not a major contender. There may be a borderline contender that has George Kittle. They're like, maybe I need to sell him before, it all goes off the tracks. So I think this might be a good time to buy. And I think you can say the same thing about Travis Kelce. So Travis Kelce started off the year, with a rough stretch. I mean, 3 single-digit games to start the year. A lot of people were saying, he's done. But in the first 6 games after the Rashee Rice injury, he averaged 22.5 points per game, which is first during that stretch. He did have a down week last week, but that's another reason where it's like, if you're buying him after 4 or 5 straight 20-point weeks, you're going to have to pay a lot more than you will after a 3-point week. So I do think there's a little bit of, again, just like with George Kittle, a team that's not contending can be like, I need to get out of this before things, before the ship goes down.
Yeah.
So you're looking at possibly either of those guys can be a tight end that has a 5 to 7 point advantage each week. Now, I don't really think either of these guys are great long-term assets. I don't know if I'd pay a first for either of them, but if you could find a way to do multiple seconds or a second and another player, I think that's something that if you're going for it, these guys could give you a huge advantage, especially if you're currently weak at tight end or if you're in a 1.75 or 2.0 reception for the tight ends league where you can start multiple tight ends. I think that this would be something to look at.
Yeah, I think what you pay is definitely dependent on that point setting, and then of course, like you said, how many tight ends you're starting. I also really like the Kittle ad just because right now he's under contract. It looks like until 2025. He's not slowing down. So and like you said, Brandon Ayuk is hurt for the rest of the season with the ACL. And he is Purdy's trusted target, so I think that's a great buy.
Yeah, I mean, arguably he is, having the best season of his career at this point. So it's, I'd ride that one if I can.
I mean, at any time, Kittle could go off for like 3 TDs and 100 yards. So I would much rather.
Well, I think that's been the knock on him before. Is it's like, he has the 3 TD games, but then he has 3 and 4 point games. He has not done that this year. He's been very consistent and had spike weeks, which
definitely.
I mean, that's match made in heaven right there.
Very, very trusted target for Purdy. I'm going to take it a little bit differently with my next one as well here, Austin, and I'm going to go with Saquon Barkley. And hear me out. I think this one, of course, you're talking just like George Pickens, another expensive player. And he's not that old. He's only 27 years old. So there's definitely other older RBs who you could get much cheaper. But what I love about Saquon Barkley right now is his playoff schedule. Right now, as of next week, he's playing the Carolina Panthers. This week, let's see. Can't remember their matchup this week. But next week, they do play the Carolina Panthers. And then as far as their playoff schedule, Yes, you have the Steelers that first week, but the last 2 weeks are against the Commanders and the Cowboys. The 30th and the
Yeah.
31st worst defenses against the rush, and Saquon has been killing it all season. He is basically, I saw it last. He's the number 3 RB on the season. Joe Mixon has moved himself up into the number 1 spot, which is another great buy. But Saquon, I think, is going to hold a little bit longer term value personally for me than Joe Mixon.
Yeah.
He's on a great offense with Jalen Hurts, with Nick Sirianni wanting to run the ball constantly. And of course, it's really at that point a toss up whether it's the tush push with Jalen Hurts on the goal line or if they're going to hand it to Saquon. And he's been getting the touchdowns. He's been getting a ton of yards on that offense. And I'd much rather have somebody on a great offense like the Eagles versus right now, you know Derrick Henry and Joe Mixon are the only other two older running backs outside of that on great offenses. So any of those three guys you could spend on, but personally, I'm taking my shot on Saquon, especially on the Dynasty's perspective with the
Yeah.
contract.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I mean, you mentioned he's behind Mixon in points per game and total points because Mixon has missed a few weeks. He's only behind Derrick Henry, but he's only 6 points behind Derrick Henry, and Derrick Henry hasn't had his bye yet. So really, you're looking at just he's played every game. He's only 6 points behind Derrick Henry, and Derrick Henry has played one more game.
Yeah.
But he has 5 less touchdowns than Derrick Henry. He only has 8 touchdowns. I say only. 8 touchdowns is a lot.
Yeah.
But he has been tackled at the 1 yard line 9 times. So, I mean, just imagine if some of those turn into touchdowns. And then, he's tackled at the 1 yard line 9 times. 7 times of those 9 is resulted in a tush push Jalen Hurts touchdown. Now, those will continue. Jalen Hurts is going to get his 1 yard touchdown runs. But the variance of being tackled inside the 1 yard line versus stretching it out over the goal line, it wouldn't surprise me if he actually picks up his touchdown pace in the second half. And that would be monstrous.
Definitely. I agree with that. So Saquon, great buy. Now changing things over to the rebuild trade targets. We have a few here. And I'll start off with mine first, and I'll have you go after that, Austin. But mine first is going to be either Caleb Williams or if you want a cheaper target, going for Anthony Richardson. And I actually recently talked about this on a recent podcast with Dynasty Dog Mike. So if you want to check that out, definitely I'll give you the handle for our Twitter, to the Super Dynasty Bros Twitter, as well as or X in my X account as well, where I talked a lot about Caleb Williams and Anthony Richardson being great buy low targets right now. And actually, this was right before the Anthony Richardson game, showing his progress that he's made that when he came back for the first game after being benched. So to go on a little bit more about Caleb Williams was the number 1 pick in the draft last year, right? This most recent draft. Right after him was Jaden Daniels. And actually, I shared something on our X account, Austin, but I had found this graphic sharing that over the last 5 weeks, and that was actually last week, so this week not even counting it. And he had a decent week. It wasn't spectacular, but his stats with Jaden Daniels right there, right? So Jaden Daniels has kind of slowed down from his spectacular start that he's had, and they've kind of evened out a little bit on where they're at production wise. But one is being bought for much more than the other. And I would much rather buy low on Caleb Williams right now. And actually, I think Mike and I talked about a potential trade offer. If you were to receive an offer for Jaden Daniels saying, I'm going to give you Jaden Daniels for 25 first and Caleb Williams, I would smash the Caleb Williams side all day because we know Caleb Williams has the talent. It's just, unfortunately, right now, he's on a bad offense. He has Matt Eberflus as his coach, who needs to be gone by the end of the season. And that offensive line is awful. Ryan Poles, as much as he's done a great job in the draft to address other needs, has not drafted one of the biggest needs, which is offensive line. And I think that's if he wants to save his job, he's got to do that this next draft or this next offseason by signing a free agent that's going to make a splash on that offensive line. Now, in regards to Anthony Richardson, that's another one where it's a great buy low. And actually, Austin, you and I are in a league right now where we saw Anthony Richardson go for a 25 first.
Yep.
Honestly, if I'm looking to the future and I want to take a shot on Anthony Richardson and he ends up turning out to be what we thought he's going to be, that's a great buy. And we probably, it could go two ways, right? You could say that this could get worse for Anthony Richardson. Yes, absolutely. But what's the off chance that potentially he takes his game up to another level and he's not going to sit for the rest of the season. They're not putting Flacco out there, so honestly, they ride with Anthony Richardson. He's getting more game time to be in NFL games, and if you end up getting a steal to get a starting quarterback in the NFL for a 25 first, I would do that.
Yeah, and one
So
that's
those guys, you got to buy low on right now.
yeah. I think those are great. I think the kind of the pile on Caleb Williams has been kind of out of control. You look at I look at the keep trade cut rankings right now. Jaden Daniels is up there, up at the very top. I've seen startups mocks where he goes number one overall, and he goes to consistently top three.
Yeah,
And then Drake May is above Caleb Williams, and Bo Nix is basically even with Caleb Williams. So you're saying that at this point, are we saying Caleb Williams is the fourth best rookie quarterback? I mean, it's possible it could turn out that way. I think all four of them are going to probably be good quarterbacks, but I actually have no Caleb Williams shares in my leagues because I just didn't want to pay the price that he was being drafted like number 6, number 7 overall in startups. People were paying, arm and a leg for the number 1 overall pick to get him. But I think at this point, he's a value. I think that there's definitely there's upside there. And I think that he will definitely ascend from where he is. Anthony Richardson, I think, is a guy that people bailed on very quickly as soon as they benched him for Joe Flacco. It was a weird situation because that lasted 2 weeks. But Anthony Richardson so this is in a 4-point passing touchdown league, in 8 games that there's only in 8 games in his career that he's both started and finished. Half of those games, 4 out of the 8, he's finished as a top 4 quarterback. So you're looking at the top 4 quarterback is, there's not many other quarterbacks who can say that they do that in half their games. So there's unbelievable upside. Now, does he score the other 4? Does he have like 5, 6, 8, 9? Yes, but the upside is tremendous there. And if you're talking about a quarterback that's valued kind of in the same range as like Trevor Lawrence, Tua Tagovailoa right now, I would way rather have the upside of Anthony Richardson versus one of those guys.
100%.
Now it depends on if you're risk averse, he's not the guy for you. But I think you definitely want some exposure to Anthony Richardson.
Yeah, definitely. So tell us your guy here, Austin.
So mine is Chris Olave. So I think what we're looking at with Chris Olave is a guy that everybody liked, but people were kind of putting him. I think as recently as this offseason, he was going, late second, early third in startups, and he's a foundational piece of teams. He reached a low point of wide receiver 26 on Keep Trade Cut earlier this week. He's currently 24.
Insane.
But obviously there's the concussion concerns. It's a big concern, but I don't think he's going to, at this point, there's no indication that he's going to retire or anything like that. It's something to keep an eye on, but I think there's a good chance this is the cheapest you'll ever get Chris Olave. And it's not really like he wasn't performing. In games this year where he got at least 4 targets, that's an extremely low bar. 4 targets for a wide receiver 1. In games where he got at least 4 targets, he's averaging 17.2 fantasy points per game. And that's great. You'll take 17.2 fantasy points any day of the week. He had the car injury. The Saints' offense is a complete mess. And their defense hasn't been. It started off the year pretty good, but their defense has been terrible. And they've been behind in games, getting blown out. So it's like there's just been a level of and they've had Spencer Rattler and Jake Hayner, and even Derek Carr hasn't been good. I think that you're going to see a full revamp of the Saints in the offseason. Now, they're in kind of salary cap hell, but I think you will see a new quarterback there. And so, there's a lot of different things that can happen. And the best thing about it all is that he's going to score you probably 0 points the rest of the year, which is good if you're in a max PF league where you're looking to, get as low of a max total points as possible so you can get as high a pick. And I see that right now on Keep Track Out, he's ranked below Tyreek Hill. If I had Tyreek Hill on a rebuilder, I would just smash a 1-for-1 trade for Chris Olave. And I think that you would get that. You could get that done because I think a contender that has Chris Olave, be like, dang, I'm probably not going to be able to use him for the rest of the year. I could use Tyreek Hill. Yeah. So I think that's that type of trade is something that where you can get the points off your roster and get the better long-term player.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be a great buy for a rebuilder.
So I like that. And then additionally with that, I think what you just mentioned about picking up a player that's going to get you 0 points for the rest of the season on a rebuilder. A player that's comparable that is going to be more expensive than Chris Olave is Rashee Rice,
Yeah.
right? So while everybody else is out there trying to get the Rashee Rices of in the dynasty world, people going after Chris Olave, it's not as common or not as popular of a
Right.
move to do. And so if you were to get that for a cheaper price, definitely do that. Right now, he's being ranked, like you said, as the wide receiver 23 on Keep Trade Cut right now, and he is
Yeah.
not worth that low. Like, I am not a big Chris Olave guy, but at the same time, I know that that's an extreme value.
I mean, you're talking about they're saying he's barely a wide receiver two. I mean, and he reached as low as 26, which would be a wide receiver three. I think at this point, it's like you're kind of the risk is baked in at that price point. Now, I think the thing that a lot of rebuilding teams fall into is I don't think I'd want to. The reason why I wouldn't target Rice as much unless you can get a steal, like unless you can trade DJ Moore for him or something like that.
Yeah,
I wouldn't trade a I wouldn't trade picks for him because I think there's a level of you want to trade point scoring assets for assets that aren't going to score points. And when you trade a picks for a player not scoring points, you kind of lose some of that advantage. So I think you want to trade away points and pick up either picks or somebody that's not scoring points. But I think Rashee Rice is. I mean, he's a guy that I think is a top 10 dynasty receiver, and if you can get him at a discount, I think probably the time to do that was back when there was some mystery about like, is this going to be a thing that makes him out for a year and a half or
yeah,
whatever? And I think that Chris Olave is a good discount version of that. I like him better than Brandon Ayuk, but Brandon Ayuk is kind of in that same category as well, where it's like relatively young receiver with some upside that got hurt. The difference, though, I think Olave's a couple years younger, and I think just has a higher ceiling. I think we've seen some spike games from him that we haven't quite seen from Ayuk. He's never quite been what we want him to be, and he wasn't very good at the beginning of the season.
right.
Olave had some down games, but it was when he got 2 targets or something like that. But when he got consistent targets, he produces. So I think he's a good
And
guy for.
and the mouths to feed on that offense. Obviously,
Yeah,
when she
yeah,
comes back, he's still going to be producing. But yeah, I mean, Olave is the most talented receiver in that room.
yeah,
So,
by far.
um, I will go ahead with my next pick here with Jonathan Brooks and Trey Benson. So these are kind of gimmies, right? I think a lot of people are already kind of thinking about, well, who's going to be the running back of the future. But I do think that there is some pieces that still can keep them fairly affordable for you. Jonathan Brooks, of course, right now with the Chuba Hubbard contract being the 4-year, $33 million contract, people were scared. And people think that, okay, well, now that they've signed Chuba Hubbard, they clearly want him long term. And so Jonathan Brooks is just going to be in a running back by committee situation. And so I think, honestly, for Brooks, he is the more talented running back. Chuba Hubbard is good. Don't get me wrong. He is producing right now, but they invested a second round pick in Jonathan Brooks, and they believe in the talent that he is. I think he's a great buy. And then as far as Trey Benson, they also, again, spent a third round draft pick on Trey Benson. They know that James Conner is going to be an unrestricted free agent next season, and they are investing in the future in this team. And also, give me the team that's got Kyler, Marvin Harrison Jr., Trey McBride, and then you add another weapon in Trey Benson. That's going to be great for the future. So I guess my question to you, Austin, because I've made a couple of trades for these guys, either down tiering or as part of pieces of trades. But what do you think? So actually, recently this trade we're going to talk about this trade later, so I won't even bring this one up.
Okay, okay.
But I actually traded away Brees Hall, and I actually talked about this with Mike back on last Saturday on the show. But Brees Hall for Jonathan Brooks and 2 firsts. Where do you take that?
Yeah, I think it's understandable. If you're in a rebuild, I think that's a good deal. I mean, you're looking at. I don't think Jonathan Brooks is going to score much the rest of this year, but I do think he will slowly have a role. I am a little concerned. I mean, they gave Chuba Hubbard a contract, I believe, 3 or 4 years,
Yeah.
so he's going to be there. But I think I think that more and more teams are going for committee style running backs anyway.
Yeah.
And I think that if Brooks is what we think he is, he's going to find a way to produce in that offense. And I think that if they continue to add talent to the team. I mean, the team is not good this year, but they're definitely better than they were last year. They're taking steps forward, and I think that, you know, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to say where they're going to go. But I think that he's a guy that a lot of people said, was clearing away the best running back in that class. And I think that I think it's good to see an opportunity. And then, two firsts on top of that is, I think that's a smash. That's a smash deal. I like Brees Hall a lot, but I think it's anytime you're paying two firsts plus for a running back, really any running back, I think it's tough in Dynasty. You're really going all in. You're trading 2 years worth of capital, assuming that's it's a 25 and 26 or something like that to invest in the most volatile position in fantasy football. Yeah. But yeah, I like your side of that.
I do think, in my opinion, and I don't know where your thoughts are on this, but as far as running backs on a rebuilder, right? Even when it is a stud, I think I'm usually trying to either down tier or offload to get more picks, and additionally just try to really build in areas of positions with less volatility. Brees Hall is a cornerstone to a certain extent, but as we're seeing this season as well, like that, the running back position is so volatile. Obviously, on a contender, much easier to buy a running back. But yeah, that's kind of where my.
But I'd rather, if I'm a contender, I'd rather pay the cheaper price for Saquon Barkley or Joe Mixon than pay two firsts and Brooks for a guy like Hall. I don't even know that. I think I would make the bet that Barkley, Mixon, Henry are going to outscore Hall the rest of the season. So I don't even know if I'd rather have Hall.
Yeah.
I think you got to look about running backs in the shorter windows. I think a 2-year window for a running back is what you're like. If they're going to smash for the next 2 years and you're a contender, they're worth having. And so the price difference between a guy like Brees Hall and a guy like Saquon Barkley, to me, I think that I'd way rather have Saquon Barkley at cost. So there's one more rebuild trade target that I wanted to go over, and then we can kind of move into some more potential trade scenarios. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay. So this one is a little surprising, and this is going to kind of go into kind of some alternate strategies as far as like what to do as a rebuilder. So this is on the surface, when I say to trade for a 30-year-old quarterback, isn't necessarily what you'd think of with a rebuilder, but I think I'm going to highlight Dak Prescott. And so he's coming off a season where he was second in the MVP voting, was quarterback 4. In seasons where he started 16 or more games, he's a top 10 quarterback 5 out of 6 seasons. That's quarterback 1, no matter the size of the league, unless you're playing in a really small league. So he is signed on to be the Dallas Cowboys quarterback through 2028. And there's almost no way out of that contract. He's going to be a starting quarterback in the NFL for the next 4 seasons. And he's going to be tied to CeeDee Lamb that whole time because he's under contract too. If he's healthy and he's the starting quarterback, he's going to go up in value from where he is right now. And that's basically a 100% guarantee. I mean, his injury is not something that's expected to affect him at all next year. He'll be out for the rest of the season, but all indications say that he'll be fine for training camp. And so, I mean, he could get another injury, but so could any player we're talking about here. So he's going to be fully recovered from that injury, and he's going to be the starting quarterback on a team that has a lot of weapons, has a lot of question marks, right? But they're going to probably have a high pick. And he's tied there for 4 years. And so I think that what you're looking at here is you're not really looking at, if you're a rebuilder that's trying to flip around and compete immediately next year, obviously it's a no-brainer. He's a good asset. But even if you're a long-term rebuilder, I think there's something to be said for kind of buying low right now and flipping for a profit later. So I think that if you have a guy like, let's say you have Kirk Cousins, Geno Smith, Matthew Stafford, Russell Wilson, somebody in that group that's kind of hanging out on your bench, people haven't really been that interested in, but they performed pretty well this year. Go to the Dak Prescott manager and say, I'll swap you 1 for 1 for those guys. I believe that the second Dak Prescott comes back out on the football field as a starting quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys, if you wanted to, you could make that swap right back. You're not going to lose value on that trade. And I would even put guys like Sam Darnold, like Will Levis, guys like that are much younger. I would still do that swap because I think those guys are less guaranteed. Even though they're younger in age, they're less guaranteed to be starting quarterbacks in 2 or 3 years. Whereas Dak Prescott, he's going to be there. He may not be super exciting, But that's a guy that he can be a foundational piece of a team that you flip around and quickly contend with, or he can be a piece that gains value and you can, whenever you want, you can take that player and get something back. I think at this point, like a guy, like take Sam Darnold, for instance, even, hey, take Trevor Lawrence, assuming that he's healthy because they're saying he might come back. I think you could flip Trevor Lawrence for Dak Prescott. Sounds crazy to do for a rebuilding team, but I do believe that the second Dak Prescott is back out on the field, he is a more valuable fantasy asset than Trevor Lawrence, and you could make a trade for another Trevor Lawrence-like player immediately if you wanted to. There's really no downside to that. Now, if this was a torn ACL or another broken ankle or something was like a more like this hamstring injury seems like, and you're a PT, so maybe you can speak into this more, but it seems like it's something that's out of an abundance of caution. They're doing the surgery, but there's expectation of a full recovery fairly early into the offseason where it's not going to affect anything going forward.
So yeah, Austin, I've been kind of out of the loop in regards to the
Yeah,
Prescott injury.
right.
What did he end up injuring in the process of when he got hurt?
I just it's a torn hamstring.
Torn hamstring. Yeah, so
Yeah,
they'll definitely be performing surgery to repair the hamstring tear.
yeah,
Typically that recovery is probably, I mean, he's going to be non-weight bearing for a time, probably at least for the first 4 to 6 weeks, and then after that, it's probably a recovery time of 6 months in rehab. And then, of course, with the NFL, you've got to give it more time. I mean, probably 9 months to a year in regards to when he can probably return to the field. So he's definitely going to be back by training camp at least next year.
yeah.
And that makes me feel pretty confident that, yeah, he can step right back out on the football field. And I agree. If you trade any of those guys that you just mentioned one for one, I would take Dak. It's just he's young enough, younger than the guys that you mentioned with Kirk Cousins and Matt Stafford, where those guys have the production, but they're also older and they're going to be out of the NFL much sooner. And then
Yeah.
also, I trust him much more than Trevor Lawrence or Sam Darnold at this point. It's
Hmm.
he's got a better offense, and honestly, when we're talking about two quarterbacks, Caleb Williams kind of has the same effect as Dak Prescott, where they get a lot of flack because of the teams that they play for. Dallas
Yeah.
Cowboys, they're always going to get way more flack, just like the Chicago Bears. If he was on a different team, I don't know that we'd be talking about the same stink as that Dak Prescott gets that he would be on a different team. So
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy the way that they talk about the guy who finished second in the MVP voting last year.
right, right, and I mean he was basically projected to break records before he got hurt a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Throwing for like 6,000 yards or something like that if they projected where the yards were going to be, and so 100%. I think he's a great buy low right now. I love that pick. Let's talk about just some hypothetical trades that you and I have kind of come up with,
Hmm.
and where we kind of sit on those. So I'll start with my first, which I'm going to go back to George Pickens, and I was actually
Okay.
looking at this. So you had mentioned right that Tillman and a second probably is a little bit too cheap probably for George Pickens right now. Let's involve a player that's got a little bit more baked in value, a little bit more buzz about him. Well, Tillman does have a lot of buzz, so I can't really say that. But I guess if you take somebody like Tank Dell, what does it
Mm.
take to sell Tank Dell for George Pickens? Are you throwing a second on that, or do you think it takes an additional? Like, do you think it takes a first?
Hmm. I so I think if I own, Tank Dell, I think I'm willing to add a second to get George Pickens.
Yeah,
If I have George Pickens, I mean, I probably play it differently. I think you could probably get some people to take that. But I just think I would be looking at George Pickens as a guy that I want a first plus four.
yeah.
But I think that you could probably get some people that really like Tank Dell, especially with his recent production. I think that he's had a slow start to the year, but he had recent production that I think is going to go away. Now that Nico Collins comes back, I think that was a little bit of fool's gold. So it might be a good time to sell Tank Dell. I think if you could do Tank Dell in a second for George Pickens, I would do that.
Yeah, I was actually offered Tank Dell for my share of Josh Downs, and it was interesting enough because I was actually really debating it. But at the end, I consulted with a few people, and they kind of all agreed that Josh Downs is just a much better place right now as far as where he is production wise. Tank Dell has fallen really far at this point
Yeah,
from
I
where he's
think I'd
been.
rather have Josh Downs. Yeah, I think it's somewhat close. I think they're similar players. I'm looking here at Keep J has them 28 and 29, but I think that they're similar players, undersized guys, really elite college production. I and then they have a quarterback that came in the same draft class. I think that when you look at those two guys, though, I think we've seen more consistency from Josh Downs with less consistent quarterback play. So I think that the upside is higher with Downs, but I prefer the quarterback. I prefer Stroud long term as a quarterback to Richardson as far as his receivers go.
Yeah,
And but the difference is that Nico Collins appears to be a certified alpha receiver in that offense, and I don't know if Tank Dell will ever really be able to be more than a complementary piece.
definitely.
Could be wrong, but I do think Josh Downs looks like he's the best receiver on the Indianapolis Colts. I think he's surpassed Michael Pittman as the best receiver on that team.
Yeah, and I mean, so going back to the George Pickens trade, I think that you take it either way with those guys. I think you could throw a Tank Dell, you could throw a Josh Downs, package them with a second, and try to get George Pickens. So
Yeah,
that's
and I
who I
think
have as one of my hypothetical trades. But what do you have next, Austin?
all right. So here's one for you. So I'm a contender, and I'm trying to get Cooper Cup. Would you
Okay.
trade Jamison Williams and a second coming off a big week for Cooper Cup? Now I think that if you put that into a calculator, it's going to show that you're losing, right? I think probably a lot of ranking places will have Jamison Williams right there, if not above Cooper Cup. But if you're looking for, because I'm assuming at this point in the season, it's unlikely that somebody that's a full on punt team still has Cooper Cup. So you're probably trying to trade him, trying to get him from a team that still thinks they can compete.
Yeah.
So you're probably gonna have to be a little bit aggressive with it. Do you think that this is a price worth paying if you're trying to win?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I actually was listening to a Dynasty FF podcast on the way home before I just got home, and they were talking about potentially purchasing Cooper Cup for 25 first, and they had said no. But they did say, "Would you pay 2 seconds for Cooper Cup?" And honestly, you take that just because you're looking at the championship this year. At least the seconds definitely mean a lot less than that first. And to me, Jamison Williams, as much as I am a Detroit fan, and I do see his stock rising, I think he is a little bit too volatile of a player for me. And I would probably value that yeah, I mean, if you're going for the championship this year and a second at Jamison Williams, that's the price you have to pay to get somebody like Cooper Cup on your team who is aging out, but it still has a lot in the tank to win a championship.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. I think it's a little bit of sometimes you can put some of these guys like even like we did the exercise with Mike Evans earlier, where it's like a second and a fourth. In reality, that might be fair value, but it's going to be hard to get someone to part with him. Again, similar type of thing where it's like, at this point, you're probably not having somebody that's a full rebuilder that's holding on to these guys that long. They probably already made a deal, so it's probably a team that's still kind of in the mix.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to win them over with something a little bit more. But yeah, that's an interesting one. I think Jameson Williams is very polarizing in the community. A lot of people love him, and a lot of people are completely out on him. So it's kind of an interesting. If you find the guy that likes Jameson Williams, you might even be able to do a 1-for-1.
Yeah.
But typically, you're probably going to have to pay a tax. Now, I will say, when you were talking about like a first and second, I think a lot of it does depend on your league format. Are you talking, if you have a 12 team start 12 league, those seconds mean a little bit more because they're more likely to be contributors. But if you're in a more shallow league, if it's a 10-team league, or if you're just starting only 8, 9, 10 players, I'm much more willing to just kind of move my seconds for startable players because the odds that the guys that you end up drafting in the second round, assuming you're not an early pick, are consistent producers for your team is pretty low. And you almost use your second round picks like currency to buy players, even if you end up selling them for more or less or just moving them around for other things. I think that
Yeah.
if you're in a shallower league, using those seconds can be advantageous.
To me, the firsts are definitely sacred, and it's much easier to acquire seconds for other players on your team. So much easier
Mhm.
than getting a first from anybody in your league.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a great deal. Um, I think, do we have two of those? Let's see here. Okay. Yep. So
So we were
my
introducing
other
the
for a
rebuilder.
rebuilder, because those were the
Okay.
contenders, was Chuba Hubbard. So uh, acquiring Trey Benson utilizing a veteran RB. So I had included this trade idea of trading away Chuba Hubbard for Trey Benson in a 25 third.
So this is where I kind of have to try to separate myself a little bit from my personal opinion because I'm not big on Trey Benson. I don't know that I think that the way the Cardinals have used him has been kind of uninspiring. I think he hasn't even been the clear cut number two. Amari Mercado has gotten a lot of work, so I kind of worry about them plugging him in as a long term solution. I think there's upside. I think there's value there, and he's a player that still holds name recognition. I think he was the second running back or maybe the third running back
He was the
taken
second, yeah.
in the draft. Um, and so there's still an opportunity to flip. I think if I was looking, if I had Chuba Hubbard and the way he's been performing lately, I would probably be looking to um, try to get a wide receiver instead. So I might try to pivot that a little bit and get someone with a little bit safer value insulation. But I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with this. I do think Chuba is not going to be able to maintain this pace. Um, so I think Benson in the third, if you like Benson,
Mm-hmm.
is decent value. Um, but I might look for something different besides Benson. But I wouldn't necessarily fault you for making that deal.
Yeah, yeah. No, I definitely see that point on Benson just because, like you said, right now, James Conner really isn't giving up the job. I mean, right, he will be an unrestricted free agent at the end of the year, but you even said Amari DiMercado's looked great, as the RB2 for that team as a pass
Well, and it wouldn't
back.
surprise me if they brought Connor back on a veteran
Not
contract
at
and
all.
and then they draft another running back and it gets. I mean, we've seen a lot of times with these guys where it's like we really get excited about somebody and they just never really give them a role. And it's like even like you look at Kendra Miller last year. It's like, oh, Alvin Kamara is going to be, he's only got a year left on his contract and he's really exciting. And then just didn't really give him much role. He was hurt some too, but then it's like, oh, actually, Alvin Kamara is now getting another contract. So I think there's a level of like there's some risk involved, but there's also like there's a name recognition there that I think I would be looking then to try to flip Benson again, or you just hold him and see what
Yeah.
happens. I think there's an opportunity, there's a chance that he is their guy next year. So I could see that. I could see
And
that
you
working out.
and you definitely brought up another piece that is again part of the process, which is trying to trade running backs on a rebuilding team and getting younger wide receivers.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I think especially this season where it seems like it's been kind of an anomaly where the running backs are staying healthier than the wide receivers. It's kind of an odd season. If you have some of these older guys, and Chuba's not really an older guy, but he's a veteran player that have been really smashing. And if you can take that and be like, all right, I'm going to trade this guy for, I mean, take Cedric Tillman, right? I think that's a guy that's like people like him. And he's kind of building up some hype, but he didn't have a great game last week. He was probably their number three receiver last week. I mean, Judy and Moore both had better games, so there could be some like, oh, okay, the run's coming to an end. Maybe you can get him back.
oh yeah.
I think something like that I'd be more excited about than Benson. I think has more of a chance to hold their value because it's like I think Benson if they draft another running back or if they re-sign James Conner, his value is going to almost nothing next year. I think that's we live in kind of such a cyclical era for running backs where it's like these guys if they don't get an opportunity pretty early on, they're not really ever going to get an opportunity. It seems like
Yeah.
I could end up being wrong on that.
And
But
this
we'll see.
next draft class is looking really strong. So
Right. I think that's part of the reason why you saw so many teams go ahead and go like we're gonna get a veteran guy because it's like okay well maybe we can draft someone next year. I mean there's like 10 guys that could be legitimate NFL running backs next year. So I think that there's kind of a we're waiting for this class and you could see I think some of these guys like Brooks and Benson, I think are good running backs, but I think they would be very middle of the pack if they were included with the 2025 class. So I think it's
I
kind
agree
of
with
like
that.
it's easy to compare them against their the people in their same class, but I'm not sure that either of them will be at the level of some of these top guys that
Yeah,
are coming in next
it
year.
really makes me wonder why Travion Henderson went back to college when he honestly would probably be a top three running back in last year's draft.
Yeah. And now he'll be probably I mean, we'll see how it goes, but I wouldn't surprise me if he's the second running back taken from his own college team next year.
All right, so you have one more
Um,
for us, Austin.
yes. Okay. So this is kind of I wanted to do kind of a fun blockbuster trade. So typically, a guy like Justin Jefferson is somebody that you're not going to trade really no matter what. Like I think you'd really have to be blown away. But how about this? You're on a rebuilding team. You are kind of right in the mix with two or three other people for 101, 102, 103, 104. And as we've seen, like the difference sometimes in some of these draft classes between getting the 101 and the 104 can be massive. So you're really trying to take points off your roster. Would you trade Justin Jefferson for Chris Olave, Rashee Rice, and let's say a mid 25 first? Let's say a playoff first, but this isn't like a top two or three team. You're going to be helping them by giving them Jefferson. But this is a team that's lost a couple of their top receivers, and it's going to be a playoff team, but might not win it all. So let's say it's going to be pick 8 or 9
Yeah.
ish.
Well, I would say as far as selling Justin Jefferson, I think both sides definitely get what they need out of that trade. I think some of the positives from the side taking Rashee for the rebuilding side, like we talked about before, out of the two players, taking away points from the team to really help that max PF, one to help if you're a rebuilder. And if you need depth at wide receiver, I think that's the one part where like you could really go either way on whether you should trade Justin Jefferson or not. Just because if you are stacked at wide receiver, it might be a trade that I'm less so inclined to take. But if you are very thin at wide receiver and all you have is Justin Jefferson and some really cheap guys that aren't really going to make an impact on your team, getting Rashee and Olave and the first would definitely be a good move.
Yeah, I think, and you kind of break it down a little bit more because I think people aren't really thinking sometimes, like when you think about Chris Olave, it's like if you got offered, I can buy Chris Olave for a first, you're probably going to do that. You can, if you buy Rashee Rice for a first and a second,
Mm-hmm.
I think you probably do that. So then you're looking at three firsts and a second, which I think is pretty good value for Jefferson.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a level of you're kind of breaking it up into different pieces. Now they aren't as liquid, right? But that could be a way that you're kind of like, okay, you have these two guys that are anchoring you down. You're not going to get any more points the rest of the year. Give me those two guys in one first. Because the thing is, it's easy in theory to say I want three firsts or four firsts for Justin Jefferson, but rarely are there teams in your league that have three or four firsts that they can trade. And if they do, it's probably a team that's just in total tank mode, and they're not going to try to trade for a guy like Justin Jefferson anyway. So sometimes you have to kind of get creative to get the value out of it. I mean, you could even, if you wanted to, go turn around and take Olave and Rice and trade them to another team tanking for picks if they're interested in those guys, and you could probably come up with four firsts from this deal. Maybe
Yeah.
conceivably, there's a possibility, or three firsts and a second, or three firsts and another young guy that you then flip for another 2 seconds, maybe. So you got to think about there's things beyond. This is what I try to do is I try to think beyond a couple steps beyond this current deal. What can I do with what I'm getting? And that's why I think sometimes even taking on a veteran player that you think you can flip in a deal, or you're like, this guy is no use to my team, but it's like, well, actually, what can I get for that guy? Sometimes can make sense for a rebuilding team.
Yeah, the liquidity for sure is an important
Yeah.
piece. So I actually have an interesting development, Austin, and this
Oh,
actually happened. This is happening real time in the league I'm in right now. So I'm a
okay.
rebuilder, and I was offered uh, two firsts. Looks like to be a late 25 first, a 26 first, and then if I'm reading this right, yep, a 25 second for Zay
Okay.
Flowers and let's see, Isaiah Pacheco. Which
Okay.
side do you take
And
now as a rebuilder?
if this is the league I'm thinking of, this is the team you've got pretty much you've got Jaden Daniels and not much else,
Yeah,
right?
it's
It's
one
kind of
QB with Jaden Daniels, and there's basically very minimal on that team. This is in full rebuild. Like we're
so here's what I think about that. So I think Jaden Daniels is a good asset. I do think that the asset is not quite as valuable in a one QB league, and he's probably your most valuable asset. It looks like you have Jaden Reed, Zay Flowers would be another one that are decent producers. I think Isaiah Pacheco is a guy on this team that you're probably not even competing next year. You're probably looking at 26 at least. You do have some good draft capital, but the I think if you can get Pacheco for any first, I think even a late first, I think is a good deal. So you kind of break that out, and then it's a first and a second for Flowers. I think that's fair on the surface, right? I think a first and second for Flowers, 2026 first and second for Flowers is pretty fair. But the question is, would you rather hang on to Zay Flowers? And I think what you got to do is kind of put yourself in the other position. Would you buy Zay Flowers? If you had an extra 26 first and an extra 26 second on this team, would you buy Zay Flowers? Probably not, right? Because you're probably looking at a spot where you're like, is it really worth taking two of my future pieces? You need a lot of pieces, right, to fill out this lineup. So you're trading two guys that could be potential pieces in your team and some liquidity for a Zay Flowers. It's a solid receiver. He's a wide receiver too. He's a solid player. But there's going to be other Zay Flowers, right? There's going to be other guys in that tier. So if you make this trade, you have that first and a second, and they're 2026 picks, and they're going to appreciate in value next year. You can take that for, if you want to, like if your team ends up ahead of schedule and you want to turn around and buy another Zay Flowers. It may not be Zay Flowers, but another guy in that same kind of tier, you can do it. So I think, and if Zay Flowers falls off, you won the trade. And if Zay Flowers does well, maybe you lost the trade in terms of value. But if you make this same trade 5 different times in 5 different leagues with people in kind of the same tier, Zay Flowers, Jaden Reed, Josh Downs, it's going to work, most of the time, where you return at least what you paid for it. So I think you're in a position where on a rebuilding team that's a true rebuild, like a long-term rebuild, you want to take, at least this is the approach I take, you want to take everybody outside of Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, like so outside of the very top value guys, whatever they're worth in picks or players that aren't scoring any points, I'm willing to trade. Now, you want to make sure you get good value, but as long as it's good, even value, I can take, especially picks, I can take that currency. I can put that value on my team that's equal to the value I gave away, but not be scoring points with it. And then I have the flexibility to turn myself into a contender if I feel like I'm ready to, and immediately go and buy another Zay Flowers next year after I've gotten the high pick, or I hang on to those picks and make the picks and continue to build the team. I think there's so many more outs that you have when you take the picks versus a player like Zay Flowers is a good player, but I'm not really sure what his ceiling. Is he ever going to be a top 8 dynasty receiver? I don't really see any path where he ends up being a guy that's like, oh, you need 2+ firsts to get this guy.
Yeah, and honestly, getting a first for Pacheco is a really good deal considering where his value's at right now coming off the injury.
Yeah, and I think you're going to look at, I think people are going to be disappointed with how much of a role Kareem Hunt still has. I mean, this is a team that's 9-1. They're in great position for the playoffs. They have a very easy schedule coming up. They're going to lock in everything probably pretty soon. Now, they might be still fighting for the number 1 seed. The loss to the Bills does hurt them somewhat, but I do think they're going to very much want people healthy for the playoffs. And I think you're still going to get production from Mahomes and Travis Kelce, but I do think the running game is going to be split. And I think Kareem Hunt is a guy that has no long-term value to them. He will not be on the team next year. So they're going to run him into the ground. They don't care if he's everything he's got is gone. It's kind of like what the Rams did with Darrell Henderson last year when they brought him in. They gave him 20 carries. And then it was just like, all right, bye, back to the practice squad. Because it's just like that's a guy that they're willing to just use to get work. They don't really need long-term. So I think that you'll see some work for that. So I'd be really, no matter where I am, Pacheco might be a guy to try to sell off some hype of returning. I like him. I think that he's a good player, but I'm not sure that he's going to produce at the level that he was before the injury the rest of the season. Not necessarily because he's going to be hampered by the injury, but I just don't think that his usage is going to be the same.
And yeah, it's funny, right? Like you compare 2 coaches that used running backs in the same way, Andy Reid and Sean McVay. They don't give a damn about your fantasy football team. They're just looking to basically get the wins and try to win Super Bowls. So
yeah.
So that was a real life trade that I was just offered. Let's talk about some other trades in real life that we have been offered recently within the last couple weeks. If you want to go ahead and lead off, Austin, since I just left us with that one.
Yeah. So on a contending team, we kind of talked about George Kittle earlier, but I did a 25 and a 26 second for George Kittle, which I think is pretty good value. I already had TJ Hawkinson and Evan Ingram on this team. So there's a little bit of I had kind of a hesitation when I was offered it. This guy kind of doing a fire sale, deciding to, he was kind of a fringe contending team, and he kind of started to realize, all right, this isn't happening this year. I need to kind of throw in the towel and build for next year. So he traded a bunch of guys, and then he offered me the 2 seconds for George Kittle. And I was like, well, I don't need a tight end. But there's a level of, even when you don't need a tight end, if you have a deal that you think is a good deal, and this is a tight end premium league, so I think it's worth taking. And then you can turn, I'm still trying to decide what I'm going to do, but I could always try to flip Ingram or flip Hawkinson for something else. But what do you think about that?
Yeah. So just go over the details of the trade one more time with me. That was
It was
25
George
second,
Kittle for
26 second
25
for
second,
George Kittle.
26 second. Yeah.
Yeah, I would do that. 100%. Just like we talked about earlier, I don't think he's worth a first. But if you're looking to contend, he's right now one of the best tight ends in football, and you know that he's kept up the consistency all season. And George Kittle and Travis Kelce, great buys right now. But I honestly would take George Kittle over Travis Kelce right now.
I would too, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
going off
All right,
of
hit
a
me.
real life trade that happened for me as a contender, and actually this one happened today. I received
Okay.
DMC for him and Zach Charbonnet for Trey Benson, a 26 first and a late 25 second. The team is 7-4, and I have Kenneth Walker as well as my other RB.
Yeah, so this is one of those, CMC is one of those players that I think we're kind of waiting to see. I mean, he's had a couple decent games. We haven't seen like the big game yet. But I think we're going to. I think that the 49ers are going to use him. They're not in a position like the Chiefs where they can kind of coast. They're in serious danger of missing the playoffs. I mean, I think they're 5-5 now, right? And they've got their next 2 games are at Green Bay and at Buffalo. They could very easily find themselves in a position where they're going to have to win out to make the playoffs after those 2 weeks. So, I think that you're going to, I mean, the NFC is a lot stronger this year too. So I think they're not going to be fine with punting a season with a lot of these older guys on the roster. I don't think they can afford to hold Christian McCaffrey back. So he's a guy I want to buy if I'm contending. So I think a first, not even a 25 first. You're paying a 26 first and Trey Benson. We've talked about Trey Benson. I think he holds some name value, but especially on a contender, he's not doing anything for you this year.
Yeah.
So I think if you break it down and you say a 26 first for Trey Benson for CMC, taking that all day.
Yeah.
And then the other part of the trade would be Charbonnet for a late second. I think you could take or leave that. I might take the second over Charbonnet, but I think the key piece there is that you do have Kenneth Walker. Charbonnet is averaging 20 points per game this year in games where Kenneth Walker doesn't play. So there's kind of an insurance piece there with that. So I like that for you.
And going back to the McCaffrey usage, they had shown some stats last week where his usage was off the charts. Of course, we know he can catch he can catch passes. They run him out of the backfield. Honestly, he's a Swiss Army knife, just like in any way that even Taysom Hill is. But of course, Christian McCaffrey only runs out of the running back position. So I think honestly, it's still like a really good buy for McCaffrey. It's just you have to know right now he's 28. Yes, he is coming off of the injury of the bilateral Achilles. But also, he is the running back one of the league when he's playing at 100%. So I think he kind of breaks some of the mold of what we try to think about running backs. And, when we look at our old running back and saying, they're not really going to do as much as they get older. But Christian McCaffrey has continued to break those ideas just the same way that Derrick Henry has.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm on board with that. I would do that if I can. So another trade I did this week. So this was kind of a 2-part trade. I'm going to highlight kind of the second part of it, but I traded. This is a rebuilding team. I traded Tyreek Hill. I'm trying to get all the details right, but it's Tyreek Hill, Aaron Rodgers, Mac Jones. This is before last week. So Mac Jones, starting quarterback going in, and Mike Williams. So just 4 really old guys. Tyreek Hill saw some value. Aaron Rodgers has a little bit of value, I think, especially. I think the guy that I was trading with had a couple quarterback injuries. I think he had Trevor Lawrence. And the return was Cedric Tillman, Jamison Williams, Jacoby Myers, and a 26 second. So I I think none of those pieces are that exciting by themselves. But the accumulation of all of it for Tyreek Hill still probably has value over the next couple of years, but none of those other guys do. It wouldn't surprise me if Aaron Rodgers retired. I think he'll probably be back for one more season. And this is kind of a team that I feel like I have the pieces in place. I have Justin Jefferson, Trey McBride in a 1.75 tight end premium. I have Drake May and Brees Hall. So I have some, and T. Higgins. So I have some good core pieces, but no depth really, and a ton of picks. So I'm just trying to be like, and I'm 4-7. So it's kind of, it's not, I could maybe trade some picks and fight and scrap and try to get the 6th seed, but then I'm probably not going to win the championship anyway. So it's probably better to go in the other direction. So my thought was get Tillman, Jameson Williams. These are guys that can probably retain their value, and if I want to trade them for contending pieces next year, I can. Jacoby Myers, I don't think has a lot of long-term value, but so what I did with that, I still took on Jacoby Myers. This kind of goes to what we were talking about last time. I took on Jacoby Myers, but then I flipped him for Christian Kirk in a 25 third. And to me, I think that Myers and Kirk are probably around the same tier. They're about the same age, and they're kind of in the same type of position. And you get a third on top, and Christian Kirk is scoring 0 points the rest of the season. So that kind of goes into that same strategy we were talking about, where you get a guy that maybe Christian Kirk's not even going to be part of my team when I'm competing, but as soon as he's back out on the football field, he's probably worth a second round pick. So I think that's kind of the idea there is I get an equivalent player who's not scoring points. For the guy I traded with, it's like, okay, Christian Kirk's not scoring anything for me. Myers looks like he's going to be the wide receiver one on that team the rest of the season. He's probably a late third, so it makes sense for him. But is that something you would look to do?
Yeah, it's so funny as we're talking about these trades, but because everybody wants to focus on the blockbuster trades, but these are the trades in the background that really are the ones that collect you the picks like you're talking about that you can get for turning over Jacoby Myers to get Christian Kirk in the third. You just got yourself a 25 third right there. What are you doing on your bench to move guys versus focusing so much on somebody like trading Malik Neighbors for, so many, 2 firsts and a younger other wide receiver? No, if you can focus on some of your bench, you can leave some of the other guys on your starting roster and still be able to collect picks. So I like that trade. I like the ability that you used a lot of the liquidity to be able to not only make that first trade, but then to take that trade, take some of the pieces, and be able to make even more value out of what you just got.
So that was the goal.
Yeah, no, that's a good trade, man. And then my trade for a rebuild that I did, and I know I had actually asked you. It was after the fact, and I was like, damn, you know what? But I still feel okay about it. I'm a big Rome believer. And so I traded CeeDee Lamb for Rome Odunze, mid 25 second and a 26 first. And, a lot of people had told me that, I probably undersold CD a little bit, which I afterwards kind of almost had a little bit of trade regret. But what do you think about that trade, Austin?
So you're a rebuilder in this league. So I think that there's a level of, if you're a believer in Rome Odunze, then you think he's worth a first plus. You probably paid a first for him at some point, either in a trade or you drafted him, I'm assuming. So there's I can see this. I mean, it's 2 firsts and a second, or maybe 2 firsts and 2 seconds for Lamb. I think this isn't a horrible trade. I probably would look for more for CeeDee Lamb, and I think that it's a tough time to sell Lamb right now. And I actually think in some ways as a rebuilder, it might be an opportunity to take your Jamar Chase or your Justin Jefferson and trade him for, can you get CeeDee Lamb in a second? Can you get CeeDee Lamb in another, like somebody in the same tier that obviously the rest of the season, CeeDee Lamb with Cooper Rush he'll be a good player. He'll be a contributor. I think we'll see 14, 15 points a game, but the ceiling just isn't there. So I think that you might be able to acquire CeeDee Lamb plus another piece, plus a second, plus another piece. Maybe even, I don't know if this would actually happen, but if you could get CeeDee Lamb and even a 27 first for Chase or Jefferson, that might be something to look to do. So I honestly, as a rebuilder, I might actually look to buy Lamb, especially because he's not going to crush you in points scored, especially if you have to trade 2 or 3 players that are scoring points for you. You might actually lose points scored or max PF in that way. But Rome is a good buy because I think he's a guy that has a lot of good potential in the future, and he's not scoring many points this year. And then 26 first, 25 second. I think I would like the trade better if it was a 25 first that you knew was at least mid.
Yeah, yeah.
But I would probably, if you had two firsts in Rome, I would like the trade better. But I think first, second in Rome, and the first is in 26. I think I like the Lamb side better, but I don't think it's a horrible trade.
Yeah. I think it's a good lesson for a lot of listeners just to look at it and think, it's not always about just trying to make the trade and continue to pile up picks, but realizing that a lot of these players are still worth the value that you're trying to trade later. And sometimes holding on to that can be better than just trading away just to I don't. And I feel like that kind of is a really big attitude to take on at the beginning. Just to say, I'm just going to try and trade away all my assets for picks, and potentially go younger. But CeeDee Lamb, like you just said, I think you can trade down potentially from an Amon-Ra St. Brown even to get CeeDee Lamb and
Yeah.
CeeDee Lamb plus. But
Yeah.
Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, great for a rebuilder, and you get a bona fide stud in CeeDee Lamb. So, yeah,
I like what you
go ahead.
like what you I like what you're saying there a lot. I think that having the mindset of I'm willing to trade everybody on my roster for the value that they're worth. So I think don't just be. I think the key is like not whoever gives me the best offer, I'm going to give it to them. You need to get value for them, but you also want to be willing to trade them because I think that if you treat picks like currency, where it's like what yes okay, so early in the season I heard a lot of people saying like I want to buy Chris Godwin is worth a first or something like that, and it's like yes, at the time, the value trade off, Chris Godwin's probably worth a first. But what else can you do with the first? And what happens when he breaks his leg? Because I don't think Chris Godwin will ever be worth a first again. And so I think that there's kind of that you want to buy things with your firsts that have kind of insulated value. And I think this was something that I've heard the Dynasty Trades and Five guys talk about is sort of like what things are you the opportunity cost of using your firsts on things, like a Chris Godwin or even guys like Mike Evans or other George Kittle or other guys we've talked about on this podcast. Is like what happens when that goes wrong? You've used your one card because a lot of times if you're a contender you probably don't have multiple firsts. You've used your one card on someone that is a very volatile asset. So, and I think it's the same thing when you are trading players for picks, you get more flexibility. And so there's a level of when you're a rebuilding team, you're not worried about setting a lineup really. I mean, you do set a lineup, but you're not worried about, oh no, I don't have a second quarterback for my super flex spot. Just plug in a guy on your bench. It doesn't really matter because you're not trying to win games anyway. So just trade your players for the value that they're worth in picks, or in players that you think will gain value without scoring a lot of points. So, but I think that it works both ways with that. But I think very much it's every trade is not just about is the value there. It's about what else could I do if I didn't do this trade.
Yeah.
And then what can I do if I do this trade? What can I then do with that? There's multiple layers to it.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point to leave off on, right? I think to leave our listeners off on something that they can kind of sit with on how to exactly look at the value of their players and how to really take their game up to the next level, which is what we're all about, right? That's why we started this podcast.
Absolutely.
We wanted to be kind of that mushroom for Dynasty fantasy football players to be able to reach and eat just like Mario. But while we're kind of on the topic, Austin, let's share some of our information with our listeners. So of course the Super Dynasty Bros inaugural podcast. This is the end, guys, and you can follow us on X. Our account is Super Dynasty 92 on X at Super Dynasty 92. You can follow me at Dynasty Big Mac FF, and as you see with Austin, you can follow him at Dynasty Austin MJ. As far as our YouTube, we will be posting this on YouTube within the next couple of days. So this should be hitting on YouTube for you either on Thursday or Friday of this week before week 12. Austin, do you have anything else to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I think just if you liked the content you saw, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, or if you heard us on X or on Twitter, just follow us. And yeah, we'd love to build up a following and give us some thoughts on what you'd like for us to talk
Yeah.
about in the future. And yeah, I'm just excited to get this going with you.
You can follow us at Super Dynasty Bros. Thanks for joining me, Austin, and everybody have a good night. Thank you for welcoming us to the community.